Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight's program, Combat Engineer with Patton's Army, presented by the author Leon Reed. My name is Jessica Laganowski, and I am the Public Services Librarian with the Adams County Library System. So before I turn things over to Leon, just a few housekeeping things for you. Upon entry to tonight's program, your microphones have been muted and your camera, if you have one, is turned off. However, we would still love to hear from you during the presentation. So for most of you below, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat feature, and some of you, depending upon your Zoom version or the device you are using, you will see the chat feature at the top of your screen. Any comments that you have during the program or any questions that you have for Leon during the program, please use that chat feature. I will be monitoring it, and at the end of the presentation, Leon has agreed to answer any questions that you have. So, feel free to interact in that way during the presentation. And also the chat feature is defaulted just to show the chat to Leon and to myself. So we'll get to see those comments and questions as they come in during the presentation. Just so everyone knows too, this program is being recorded and will be available on the Adams County Library System's YouTube channel in the next few days. You can visit the YouTube channel by visiting the Library System's website at www.adamslibrary.org and scrolling about halfway down the main page until you'll actually see the link to the YouTube channel. From there, you'll have access to a variety of programs. We have story times on there. We have other presentations and other programs that we have recorded over the last couple of months on there. We have book reviews that the staff have done. We have read-alouds. We just have a whole list of different types of programs and events listed on the YouTube channel. If you're interested to see what's added on you can certainly subscribe to the YouTube channel. We add content on a very regular basis, so subscribe and we'll let you know right away when there is something new to the channel. Want to thank we have some sponsors for this evening's program, so thank you to James and Cathy Gardner and WellSpan Health for being tonight's sponsors for the program. And as a note, some of you may have looked already for this particular book in the Library Systems collection. We don't have it quite yet, but we will very soon have it in our collection. However, in the meantime, we do have other works by Leon Reed, so I do strongly encourage you to check those out from the library. And you can find those by searching the library's catalog online, and you can also visit the library and speak to a staff member about getting one of those on hold. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Leon and his wife Lois, who also plays a very important role in this book. Lois Lembo is the daughter of Frank Lembo, the primary subject of the book. She was a defense consultant specializing in naval war games and manufacturing technology and industrial base issues. She's at work on the prequel to A Combat Engineer with Patton's Army, which covers the training of Army engineers in World War II. And the bio for Leon. Leon Reed worked as a U.S. Senate aide and as a defense consultant, specializing in the Defense Production Act and defense preparedness, and as a U.S. history teacher. He now lives in Gettysburg, where he volunteers with the National Park and writes military history books. Frank Lembo, the subject of the book, was his father-in-law. And so, Leon, I will go ahead and turn things over to you.
Okay, thank you. Why did I go to launch meeting? Is my screen visible?
I do see your screen. I see the PowerPoint.
There's the slideshow.
Perfect.
Perfect. The title of the book that I'll be presenting about is A Combat Engineer with Patton's Army, the Fight Across Europe with the 80th Blue Ridge Division. I'm the speaker, but the secondary author of the book. This book was a labor of love for probably nearly a decade by Lois, originally written as basically a family project for her brother, her nieces, other people in the family. It became a book endeavor very late in the process. This book covers Frank Lembo's time in Europe. There's a brief prologue introducing him and talking just a little bit about the training, and a brief epilogue describing, his life after the war. But basically it covers from the minute they got on the Queen Mary to deploy to Europe until he came home in January 46. We do have a separate book on training that's being written now. The book covers the story at several different levels. The foundation of it, the 86 letters Frank wrote to his fiancée during his time in Europe, plus various postcards, photographs, souvenirs, newspaper clippings, and other things Frank sent home. It also talks more basically about what the engineers were doing. The letters were certainly our most important source. The second most, Frank kept the typescript of the company diary, and that gave us and other records gave us a very good idea what the engineers were doing day to day. From the copious amount of after action reports filed by the infantry regiments, we get a good insight into, why the engineers were building that bridge, what the infantry did after they ran across the bridge. And then just a little bit for seasoning of the machinations of Ike and Bradley and Montgomery, the higher headquarters grand strategy. Some introductions. The main characters in the book, Frank Lembo and Betty Craig, at the time, Frank's fiancée, his wife of nearly 60 years. Frank and Betty had an off and on relationship since high school. Frank was more certain than Betty that they were made for each other. They had become engaged 7 or 8 months before Frank deployed. There are no letters from Betty. Frank had to destroy her letters, but her personality shines through brightly in Frank's responses, to her, the things she wrote in her letters. Also important characters in the story are the boys. Through most of the war in Europe, Frank was a sergeant. He, late in the war, was promoted to second lieutenant and commanded a platoon, but most of the war, he commanded a squad, which was 13 men. This photo, this was an interesting photo. We had the letter, we knew about Lem's junk, and then we had this photo, and we knew it's soldiers, could be anybody. And then one night I noticed that there was writing on the front of that truck in the background, and then I saw over in the very left corner that was Lem's junk. So these are some of the boys in Frank's squad. This photo is an interesting corrective. We talk about the greatest generation. When I became aware of them, they were like 40 years old. They were the guys, my dad's friends when I was 8, 10 years old. And that's been my durable image of a World War II soldier. When we talk about the greatest generation, we sent boys over to fight World War II. Except for the helmets, this could be a photo of a soccer team. It's just important to keep in mind who accomplished what went on in that war. The mail, obviously the foundation of this book is the letters. The mail was an important part of the war effort. 5 billion pieces of mail a year sent by soldiers, probably a larger number than that sent from the home front. Frank, just from mentions he made in the letters, besides writing to Betty, we know he wrote frequently to his parents, his 3 sisters, to Betty's brother, to various neighbors and friends. This was vital to the war effort, both for morale at the front and morale on the home front. Topics of Frank's letters, occasionally references to the war, more often GI life, frequently gripes about people on the home front who don't appreciate the sacrifices we're making, and a lot of interpersonal stuff with Betty. Assurances that he's not gambling and drinking, carousing with French or Luxembourgeois or Belgian women, etc. So let's move on. The 80th spent a prolonged period in training. They weren't programmed to join the war until well after D-Day. So there was a period where there were a lot of well-trained Army divisions, but they weren't sent to New Guinea, they weren't sent to Italy, and there was kind of a, so what do we do with these guys? They did their basic training in Tennessee, spent a time in Kansas, and then maybe the ruggedest training the Army had on offer during the war. They spent about 4 months in Yuma, Arizona. All the biographies of other soldiers, Frank's letters, described that part of their training as really kind of hell on earth. Engineers. The Army didn't move without engineers. Frank's unit, the 305th Engineer Combat Battalion, was what's called division engineers. They were within the division. They normally did their work attached to an infantry regiment. They would be ferrying the troops across the river on the assault crossing and building footbridges. There were other engineers who would come along later and build the permanent bridges after the soldiers had moved on. I did a very unscientific survey of the company diary, just a check mark for each time a task was mentioned. Overwhelmingly, the number 1 task for Frank's company was clearing mines and booby traps, building or repairing roads, filling craters, etc. Reconnaissance of riverbanks and roads. These were often behind enemy lines. Building or repairing bridges was 4th. I mean, this is what engineers are thought of as bridge builders, but you have mines to clear every inch of the way. You only build a bridge when you get to a river, so it's a more occasional task. Finally, fighting as infantry. Getting toward the end of the introductions, the generals, starting at the top, the upper left photo, Dwight Eisenhower was the commander of all the Allied operations. His immediate subordinate, Omar Bradley, Army Group Commander, and then Patton, Army Commander. That photo was taken in Bastogne, I believe in January 45. Next level down, or sorry, between Bradley and Patton, on the upper right photo, is 2 corps commanders. The fellow on the left, Manton Eddy, 3rd Army was in his corps most of the war. The other fellow was 15th Corps, Wade Hazlip. They're discussing probably the shortest lived plans ever created in World War II. They're meeting on December 15th to discuss plans. The German attack in what became the Battle of the Bulge happened about 6 hours after their meeting. Bottom right, Patton and his dear friend, Sir Bernard Law Montgomery. Finally, lower left, the 80th Division Commander, Horace McBride. Frank's experience in the war broke up into pretty nice segments. In August, they were had their baptism of fire. But then the German collapsed in Western France, and for about a week, it was literally just a joyride across France. September, there was hard fighting to cross the Moselle River and hold the hills beyond. Late September through November, they're slogging their way through the French province of Lorraine. Then the dash north to the Ardennes. New Year's that set off a real bout of hoping for peace and dreams of the future. Finally, spring 45, the final campaigns through Germany. This map, it's a little hard. There, I can get a cursor. The borders here are England and France. This is the English Channel. Argentan, the red line marks the route. Argentan, their first baptism of fire. This whole path is 1 week as the German army is in full retreat toward the German border. The famous losing his fuel. The first halt was right here at the end of August. This line is 1 week. This line is 3 months, the Lorraine campaign. Basically, you know, a Woody Hayes 3 yards and a cloud of dust campaign through Lorraine. The race up to the Bulge, Bastogne, and then finally the spring campaign, 1945. On VE Day, they were in Austria. So Argentan, their first combat. The German army was basically surrounded. It's referred to as the Argentan Falaise Pocket. There was about a 20-mile wide gap. Patton, 80th Division was assigned to take Argentan, which was at the southern end of the pocket. Photos, the infantry regiments, the fighting power in the 80th Division was the 317th, 318th, 319th Infantry Regiments. This shows some of the infantry regiments in Argentan, obviously after the town has pretty much been reduced to rubble. 2 different regiments, obviously they're posed in front of the same store. The chase across France, a lighthearted romp. There's literally no resistance. The 305th Engineers did 330 miles in a single day. That's in a convoy on dirt roads. A long day. One of Frank's letters, it's good moments. The French keep throwing wine bottles and eggs at us. The other day we got 160 eggs, came in handy for breakfast. One consequence of the romp is they moved faster than their supplies could keep up. The Allies had planned on a slower advance across France and that the supplies would be able to keep up, and Patton just outran his supplies. A lot of Frank's letters are the funny things the boys are up to. The photo is a photo by Frank of some of the engineers in a recently liberated village. Had a rodeo in the pasture, lassoing cattle. Where their living arrangements and their cooking were big preoccupations of Frank in the letters. He was very proud of his squad's cooking abilities. Went down to the river, the boys wanted some fish, so we took a couple blocks of TNT, got all the fish we needed. Took out a minefield, blew them up, and shook the heck out of everything. Again, we remember these are the greatest generation and they're fighting to liberate the world, but they're also a bunch of young kids away from home for the first time, and they have access, since they're engineers, to almost unlimited quantities of TNT. The Moselle was really the first serious challenge. There was hard fighting at Argentan, but no difficulty other than just blasting ahead. The Moselle River crossing was a real problem. Patton had had his fuel taken away for a few days. He was still convinced the Germans are finished. So when he got his fuel back, it was go, go, go. Don't take time to recon. No need to cross under cover of darkness. You know, they're probably 50 miles away. It was a bloodbath, the first crossing. 317th Regiment in particular almost got wiped out. The fight, they did finally get across the river, and the German defense of the hills just beyond the river was intense. Frank wrote about we enjoyed seeing this bridge in the area where the engineers crossed the 80th Division. Bridge was destroyed in September 1944. Obviously, that would have been done by the Germans, and it was rebuilt in 1953. Obviously, the Allies would have been happy if that bridge had been there. Things popped for us 2 nights ago. Basically, behind them on the hills was a line of about 1,000 machine guns just opened up on the Germans. And the engineers, while they were basically busy building their bridge, were very impressed by the amount of firepower. He also, the quote under the photo of the bridge, the high command and the home front had both become convinced the war was over. So Frank commented, I guess it was quite a jolt to you people back home that things have slowed down over here. Shortly after they got across the Moselle, they had their supplies taken away again. This time for a whole month. Basically, they spent the month of October at a pause. They fought one day in the month of October. It was the division's bloodiest day of the war, but otherwise they were at a pause. Patton, we see his attitude is we'd like to go to China and serve under Nimitz. Frank, of course, saw the bright side. You know, we have time to settle down, got generator going, living in buildings, life's not that bad. Obviously, they understood we're not finishing the war and getting home, but there's worse things that can happen than living in buildings and, you know, cleaning out all the heifers and chickens in the area. During the pause, the next objective the division had when they again got rolling was to cross the Selle River. The Selle crossing might have been the best reconnoitered crossing there was, because they had a whole month to send patrols out across the river to check out. They literally knew where every machine gun nest, every little pillbox, you know, every artillery emplacement was on the other side of the river. Frank was sent across the river at least once, earned a Silver Star, the Army citation in inimitable Army language, deep in hostile territory, severe enemy fire, voluntarily remained in exposed position. Frank would not talk about this. Just while I was around, I watched Lois go at her dad about the Silver Star at least 5 times. He had 2 answers. One was, it was nothing. And the other was, sometimes he'd get a little misty-eyed and he'd just say, I don't want to talk about it. He did treat it characteristically lightheartedly in the letter he wrote at the time. To Betty, dumb luck, ran us straight into a German outpost. Heck of a time. I'll tell you about it after the war. It's rather humorous. Lois began to show a deep interest in Frank's World War II experience, you know, really from the time she was a kid. He made no secret of, you know, he had been in Bastogne. He had a Silver Star. The basic outlines, he would say, oh yeah. The only stories I ever heard him tell were kind of lighthearted stories. His pride that he got to do the fireworks show for the whole division. 2 months after the end of the war, his frustration that he was going to get to build a footbridge for Patton, and he broke his arm and was in the hospital, things like that. Like many World War II veterans, getting at the combat part of the story was nothing doing, but he did leave us the letters. Sometimes he would let his guard down and kind of confess war is hell. The last two quotes are shortly after the one day of combat in October, which was the bloodiest day of the war for the division. 115 men killed in one day. Can't say when this will be over. We fight yard by yard and then fight to hold it. Things have been pretty tough, lost some good friends, hurts deep. No sense keeping thinking about them. May the dead rest in peace and the wounded get well again. Not a lot of those kind of references in the letters, though. The cell crossing, when they finally got permission to go, one thing that helped them, the weather was so bad, the Germans, the after action interviews, it never occurred to them the Allies would move. The river was so high, the weather was so bad, the roads were so bogged down. They put in a bridge that collapsed, and so they spent most of a day in a river, getting the bridge out from underwater. Frank couldn't swim, so we could imagine spending time in a river for a whole day. The assaults on the Majino line came next. The Majino line faced the other way. Obviously, it was French defensive forts, but still they were fortifications. One is the one on the right is a picture taken in 1944. The one on the left from darn near exactly the same spot of the same fort. You can see the tree, most prominently see it in the black and white photo, but you can see the features on the tree. It's the same tree 40 years later. The fighting in Fabersville, Frank sent Betty this clipping, sort of as you guys on the home front think you know what combat's about. This is what combat's about. Jimmy Cannon, who later became a very famous sports writer, wrote an article for Stars and Stripes about the fight in this little town. The dead hold Fabersville once the enemy did, and then we came, they returned, and so did we. Today, only the dead are there. So by mid-December, they have finally fought their way through Lorraine. Patton's attitude about Lorraine, he wrote this letter in disgust to George Marshall. I hope you insist the Germans retain Lorraine. I can imagine no greater burden to be the owner of this nasty country. The reminiscence of the 305th was this was a really tough month. But just as they're finishing the Lorraine campaign and literally firing up the tank engines to pitch into Germany, the German Arden offensive occurred about 150 miles north in the Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg. The famous, if you've seen the Patton movie, the George C. Scott movie, he said words to the effect of, I can attack with 3 divisions in 72 hours. The 80th was one of the 3. They already had planned the movement, and the attack into Germany had been halted, and the 3 divisions were moving before that meeting ended. A really complicated move. You've got supply points oriented to move an army east into Germany, and now that army is moving north into Luxembourg. Obviously, you've got no maps, no scouting of the roads. That would have been the engineer's job. They would have been out ahead of the 80th, basically doing, really first level scouting and route marking, and also perennially removing mines and obstacles. When they got to Luxembourg, initially the 80th Division was assigned to liberate the city of Edelbrook and a number of villages in the area. The captain in the 319th wrote this description of house-to-house fighting. He wrote it about a town in Luxembourg, but it could have been universal. The GI infantry, the combat rifleman's experience in World War II was basically house-to-house fighting. And what he describes, it's a real shock and awe. You know, the tanks are firing, we're using the tanks as direct fire support. Then we signal them to stop. We pour through the holes in the buildings. The Reckon Second said if they got a house on each side of the street, they would inevitably capture the whole street. Basically a really violent, adrenaline-fueled effort. It's interesting to think back to the photo of the boys in the squad and read this. There's a sort of a mythology that I've heard of many people say, how come soldiers today get PTSD and we never hear about that from World War II or the Civil War? And my answer is we never hear about that because we didn't have the terminology, but we had it. If you read any memoirs of children of World War II veterans, many of them had a really, if dad falls asleep in the chair, get out of the room, don't make noise. You don't want to be around when dad wakes up. Going through this experience day after day after day after day, you can understand how tough things would have been for many when it was all over. In the southern end of the Bulge, obviously the main show was the defense of Bastogne. Initially, Patton assigned 4th Armored to liberate Bastogne. It's very slow going. And the soldiers in Bastogne let 4th Armored know, we're anxious for you to get here. On Christmas Eve, 2 battalions of the 318th Regiment were pulled out of line to be attached to 4th Armored. And as it happens, Frank's platoon was assigned as the engineering complement for that detachment. The map is a hand-drawn map from an after-action report of the 318th showing their approach to Bastogne. A brutal, mile-by-mile slog. The Germans, they knew where the relief was coming from, and they threw everything at trying to keep them from linking up. On the 28th of December, the 318th did link up with the defenses of Bastogne. They had a few hours to go in the village, had a Christmas dinner. Always look on the bright sides, the guy writing the after-action report. Since rations had been drawn for 350 men, there was ample food for all. For its conduct in that campaign, the 2nd Battalion of the 318th earned the Presidential Unit Citation, and all attached units, including Frank's platoon, were included in that citation. So Frank earned the right to wear that citation. He wrote several letters during the mission. Rather tired today, didn't get to bed. This would have been the night they pulled out of Edelbrook and made their trek cross country to get to the armor. Didn't get to bed until 5 a.m., up at 8:30. Jam-packed with things to write about, but I can't write about them. The battle that was going on Christmas Day is still going on in increasing fury. Something has got to give soon. I doubt it will be us. Patton's weather prayer is portrayed in the movie. At Christmas time, he sent out a greeting to everyone in Third Army. Actually, what you see is probably bigger than the actual card there about the size of a business card. On one side was his Christmas greetings to every officer and soldier in Third Army. And the other side was the weather prayer. Frank sent his copy home, and we still have it. One of the real proud keepsakes from the war. One of the nicest pieces of soldier writing I've seen, January 2nd, been back from Bastogne for a couple days. It's New Year's. Things are quiet, a little reflective maybe. Sometimes I can make it all the way through reading this. Sometimes I can't. I was just thinking about that last day together we had and how perfect it was and how long away I've come since then. I can remember the boat ride to England, our trip across the Channel, going into action and suffering 1,000 deaths when we heard our first artillery shell, the mad dash across France, a ride with its wine, flowers, ripe tomatoes, and eggs, the storming of our first river, that's the Moselle, the fighting beyond, Christmas in Belgium, Bastogne, New Year in Luxembourg. Yes, we've come a long way. We're a little tired, a little older, and a little bitter. We fight hoping each battle is the last one, with thoughts of going home and enjoying a peaceful life. Our thoughts run to our sweethearts, who we long for, each letter being a 5-minute furlough with the one you love. That 5-minute furlough is a thought we really sort of took aboard as every one of Frank's letters, thinking of him, kind of sitting there with, often artillery shells going off nearby, either inbound or outbound, and giving himself a 5-minute furlough to write a letter to Betty. Lot more stuff. I'm approaching my limit, so I'm going to flip through a lot of these. Basically, oh yeah, I think of being married in the damnedest place. Abe and I had to dive down because fire was coming in. I just started thinking about walking down the aisle with an organ, and then one dropped about 40 feet away, and then I started thinking about other things. Miss you. The Bulge did sort of lead to hardening attitudes about the Germans. Frank expressed real disgust, real hostility toward the Germans. Didn't act on it. But there was a real sense these people have brought unbearable suffering to the world, and we thought they were ready to give up, and now they pull this on us, and so we're really going to have to get tough with them. In their campaign across Germany, Third Army discovered the first Western concentration camp at Ordref. This was the one famously Ike came to visit a week or two after it was liberated, and he insisted he wanted to see everything. I want to see inside every closet. I want to climb up and look in the attics, because someday somebody's going to say this never happened, and I'm going to be able to tell them, you don't know what you're talking about. It happened. And he ordered every unit in Third Army to send a representative delegation to tour the camp. Occupation duty, still a lot of work to do, suddenly transporting displaced persons all over Europe, constructing POW facilities, but a lot of recreation too. When we were in Austria, we found the site of the castle, which was the division recreation camp that they built, now a nice seaside resort. At any rate, to come to a close, Frank was offered a career in the Army. Betty was, she had accepted the ring, but she's all still a little, I don't know. Frank got leave, went home, said, Betty, either we get married now or I'm re-enlisting, and then, it's up to you. She said, oh, of course I'll marry you, Frank. Don't be silly. Frank did put in his papers, came home, they got married. in their correspondence early on, they had sort of designed their dream house in the mail, and basically Frank built that house and lived in it the rest of his life. Golf became his passion. Raised 3 children in that house. He very quickly lost touch with his Army buddies. Their love story lasted nearly 60 years after the war. Frank passed away just a couple weeks before their 60th anniversary. And a word from our sponsor. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, Gettysburg Heritage Center. For those of you who are local, you can buy a copy of the book either at the store or there's their website. And with that, I thank you. I'm gonna unshare my screen. And if anybody has questions, I'd be glad to answer any questions people have.
So there is something in the Q&A. Nancy had said, any mention of the 11th Division and liberating artwork as it appears in the movie Europa?
Unfortunately, Frank's letters ended. The last letter we have that Frank wrote was the end of February, 1945. And they had literally were in the process of crossing into Germany. The spring campaign was March, April. So, for example, the comments I made about Ordref, there's no letters from Frank about that. That's just, we continued the story from general knowledge. We do know the 3rd Army, perhaps right around the same time they discovered Ordref. They discovered the Kaiserota salt mines in Merkers, which was nearby. And that was, I believe, the first Western discovery of both gold and art treasures from the Germans that were buried there. They had intended to get them away, spirit them away, and the 3rd Army just advanced too fast. But no, we don't have anything from Frank about the spring campaign. Sorry.
He said he thought.
Yeah, Frank did tell us. It was one of the few, Lois reminds me, Frank did say he remembered being in salt mines and seeing, artwork stacked up in crates in the corner. And GIs stealing it. Yeah.
Well, before this started, Leon, you were telling me a little bit about how mail actually got to the regiments. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that.
It was an unbelievable story. It's worth a presentation itself. The Army recognized that they considered mail to be almost on a par with fuel and ammunition in terms of its importance to the war effort. They computed that the average GI wrote 6 letters a week and probably received an equivalent number or more. Frank far exceeded that. Frank wrote 10 letters a month to Betty while he was in Europe, far more than that while he was in training. Plus, he wrote his parents, he wrote his sisters, he wrote his friends. He wrote to the wives of guys in his squad, to tell, I just wanted to tell you your husband's doing a great job. And, he talks about you all, that sort of, he got packages from home. He would talk about, got a package from mom. The sweater was really nice, but what we really appreciated was that little bottle of whiskey she slipped in there. We killed it off in no time. How it worked, you would address it to the soldier by his unit. Frank Lembo, APO New York, Army Post Office New York, 80th Division. That's basically, it would all go, if it was bound for Europe, it would go to a single mail processing facility in Brooklyn, a massive facility. They would sort it, this is a post office facility. They would sort it by unit and then hand it on to the Army. As they said, they know where their soldiers are, we don't. And then it was just a decision tree. You know, you're distributing it to the division and then to the regiment and then to the, their bitterest fighting of the war was the Sauer River crossing. That's the crossing from Luxembourg into Germany, right at the end of the Battle of the Bulge, early February. During that crossing, they're still getting mail. The Army went to extraordinary lengths to get mail. If you're in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, we're going to figure out how to get you your mail, and we're going to figure out how to get your mail to your family. There were times the mail was held up, like during the real fuel shortages. Frank mentions a couple times, we're not getting our mail because they're holding it up at the port. But for the most time it got there, he would mention, 9, 10, 2 weeks was a pretty good time. Soldiers could send free mail that would go by the slow boat, literally. Frank and Betty usually used airmail, and it went a little faster. They created V-mail because the volume was so huge. This was really the first use of microfilm. Kodak and the Army came up with it, where they would process all the letters, photograph them, put them on a roll of microfilm, send them home on airplanes, and then at the other end, reprocess them back into a letter and deliver them. It cut down the volume by about 90%.
Great. Yeah, please feel free if you have any other questions to ask Leon. We'll give a few moments. You can use the chat feature to do that. Well, and I had mentioned at the beginning, Leon, that you have also written several other books, some of which that we have in our library system. Would you care to share some of the titles or some of the other topics that you have written on?
Yeah. Obviously, a person in Gettysburg writing a World War II book is, a little odd. I didn't set out to write World War II books, and most of the other stuff I've written has a Civil War theme. I've done 2 photo books on the monuments here in Gettysburg. One, Stories the Monuments Tell, my first book. I was a regular visitor to Gettysburg for probably 30 years before we moved here. And I appreciated the monuments, but for the most part, they were just, here's where the soldiers were. When I moved here, I started exploring the battlefield on my bike, and going at 3 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, you notice things. And I started, there's Sally the dog. Boy, that's an interesting story. I never knew that. Gee, why is this monument to 2 regiments? Why is, you start thinking, that's a funny little bird there, and a mama bird feeding her birds in a nest. That's kind of odd for, boy, that guy really looks sad. I wonder what's on his mind. The monuments were mostly put in by the veterans. They were put in around the time of the 25th anniversary. And if you put a study in, you realize some of these soldiers had something on their mind that they wanted people to know. So anyway, the book talks just about, some of the messages the soldiers, the veterans were sending us, what they what they wanted us to know about their monuments. There's another one on the Confederate monuments, which is obviously a fairly slender book. And then I've got a children's book about Jenny Wade.
Okay, we do have a question. Was Frank able to see a USO show?
Oh, many. Yeah, no, they did an amazing job entertaining the soldiers. And it was really important. One, he didn't, this was after, they made the trip, they did their occupation duty in Bavaria, near Kaufbeuren, Kempten, if anybody knows the geography of southern Bavaria. Many of the soldiers took about a 4-hour train ride to Garmisch, where the Winter Olympics in 1936 had been held, and saw a show by Billy Rose. The night, yeah, this one amazes me. The two thoughts are widely separated. I had to put it together, but the mid-October mission where he won his Silver Star, he came home obviously in the dawn hours of that morning. About 6 hours later, he and a bunch of his buddies went and saw Marlene Dietrich in a USO show that he wrote to Betty about. It was a little raw, but good humor. But I would think if I had just, run into a German ambush and, risked my life, my nerves might be a little too jangled 6 hours later to enjoy Marlene Dietrich, although it might be just what the doctor ordered. We have not a photo of Frank's. We found a photo at the archives of her posing with a bunch of 80th Division soldiers at after that show. Obviously, Frank's not in the photo, but yeah, movies as well. The soldiers did not live a monk's life. Young men, they're obviously they were serious about their business. When the time came to be serious, when the bullets are flying, we're busy doing our work. But at night, we're basically teenage boys away from home. And movies, if there was if they had an opportunity to liberate a wine cellar, they were not going to turn it into the alien property custodian. They were going to liberate the wine, promote it. That was they would always refer in the diary to having promoted, like spare parts for a Jeep or something. That meant sort of, 5-fingered requisition. But they would promote content, particularly toward the end of the war. But they never missed a chance for entertainment. And the USO, they followed the front lines. During that Sour River crossing where it's just violent combat every day. I don't think there were USO shows, but they had movies at night. It was, he had a lot of chances. He got Liberty in Paris twice. One of them, he took a lot of photographs and wrote a very extensive letter about the tour he took of France and going to Notre Dame and stuff like that. The second one, he just sort of mentioned he'd had a pass in Paris.
All right. Well, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much, Leon, for sharing your father-in-law's stories by his letters. And for everyone who's listening, make sure to take a look for this book very soon in the library system. We have programs that we're currently scheduling for 2021, so definitely take a look at all of our social media and on our events calendar on the website. And so I wish everyone a good evening and stay warm. It's going to be a cold one tonight.
Yeah, well, it's something. I guess there are some things we can be grateful that Zoom
Yes.
is available, and we don't all of us now have to grab our coats and run through the cold to get to a cold car.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Leon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.